The price of her innocence was exactly one thoroughbred stallion, no more no less, a transaction that would have been laughable if it weren't so devastatingly real, reducing Lady Violet Marlowe from a nobleman's daughter to nothing more than currency in her father's desperate gamble to save his crumbling estate from complete ruin. Lady Violet Marlowe stood in the draughty entrance hall of Marlowe Manor, her slender fingers clutching a worn leather valise that contained everything she owned in the world, while her father paced before the dying embers of what had once been a grand fireplace. At 19, she possessed the kind of ethereal beauty that poets wrote about, flowing auburn hair that caught fire in candlelight, violet eyes that seemed to hold depths of wisdom far beyond her years, and delicate features that spoke of gentle breeding despite the shabby circumstances that now surrounded her. "The carriage will arrive within the hour," Lord Marlowe announced, without looking at his daughter, his voice carrying the hollow tone of a man who had long since abandoned any pretense of paternal affection. "You will conduct yourself with dignity, Violet. Remember that you represent what remains of our family's honor." Honor. The word tasted bitter in Violet's mouth as she contemplated the irony of her father's statement. What honor was there in selling one's daughter to settle a gambling debt? What dignity could be found in a marriage arranged not for love or even political alliance, but simply because the Duke of Kensington owned a horse that her father had wagered and lost in a moment of drunken foolishness? "Yes, Papa," she replied quietly, her voice betraying none of the turmoil that raged within her heart. Years of living with her father's increasingly erratic behavior had taught her the value of silence, of accepting whatever fate thrust upon her without complaint or resistance. The Duke of Kensington, Alistair, she reminded herself, for he would soon be her husband, was a man she had never met, though his reputation preceded him like a shadow. At 32, he was known throughout London society as a brilliant but cold aristocrat who had withdrawn from public life following some unnamed tragedy. The whispers spoke of a man who trusted no one, who conducted his affairs with ruthless efficiency, and who had shown no interest in marriage until her father's desperate proposal had somehow captured his attention. "The Duke has been most generous in his terms," Lord Marlowe continued, still avoiding his daughter's gaze. "Your dowry debt will be forgiven, and you will want for nothing as his Duchess. It is far more than you could have hoped for, given our circumstances." Violet bit back the response that rose to her lips, that she had never asked for wealth or position, only for the chance to choose her own destiny. But such luxuries were not afforded to daughters of bankrupt nobles, and she had learned long ago that dreams were dangerous things for women in her position. The sound of carriage wheels on gravel announced the arrival of her transport to a new life, and Violet felt her stomach clench with a mixture of fear and resignation. She was about to become the wife of a stranger, bound to a man who saw her as nothing more than the solution to an inconvenient debt. "Remember, Violet," her father said, as the footman appeared to collect her meager belongings, "you are a Marlowe. Conduct yourself accordingly." As the carriage pulled away from the only home she had ever known, Violet pressed her face to the window and watched Marlowe Manor disappear into the morning mist. She was leaving behind a life of genteel poverty and emotional neglect, traveling toward an uncertain future with a man who had purchased her as casually as one might buy livestock at market. The journey to Kensington Hall took the better part of the day, winding through the English countryside as autumn painted the landscape in shades of gold and crimson. Violet tried to find comfort in the beauty of the scenery, but her mind kept returning to the man who awaited her, this duke who had agreed to marry a complete stranger to acquire a horse that had caught his fancy. What manner of man conducted his personal affairs with such cold calculation? What kind of marriage could possibly result from such a transaction? As the carriage rolled through increasingly grand countryside, Violet found herself wondering if she was traveling toward salvation or merely trading one form of prison for another. Kensington Hall rose from the landscape like something from a Gothic novel, its imposing stone facade and towering spires speaking to centuries of wealth and power. As Violet's carriage approached the grand entrance, she felt her breath catch at the sheer magnitude of the estate that would soon be her home. This was a far cry from the crumbling gentility of Marlowe Manor. Here was wealth beyond imagining, power that stretched back through generations of noble blood. The carriage came to a halt before massive oak doors that could have accommodated an army, and Violet found herself hesitating as a liveried footman stepped forward to assist her descent. This was the moment of no return, the threshold between her old life and whatever awaited her within these imposing walls. Lady Violet Marlowe, announced the butler, a distinguished man whose bearing suggested he had served the Kensington family for decades. His Grace is awaiting you in the library. Violet followed the butler through corridors lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, their painted eyes seeming to judge her worthiness to join their illustrious ranks. The library, when she finally reached it, was a magnificent chamber filled with leather-bound volumes and dominated by a massive fireplace where flames danced against the gathering dusk. And there, standing with his back to the door as he gazed out a tall window, was the man who had purchased her future. Duke Alistair Kensington was taller than she had expected, his broad shoulders filling out an impeccably tailored coat of midnight blue. His dark hair showed threads of premature silver at the temples, and when he turned to face her, Violet found herself looking into eyes the color of storm clouds, grey and intense, holding depths of intelligence and something else she couldn't quite identify. "Lady Violet," he said, his voice carrying the cultured tones of the aristocracy, but lacking any warmth of welcome. "I trust your journey was comfortable." "Yes, Your Grace," Violet replied, offering a curtsy that she hoped conveyed proper respect despite her nervousness. "Thank you for your hospitality." Alistair studied her with the same intensity he might have applied to examining a piece of art he was considering for purchase. Violet felt heat rise in her cheeks under his scrutiny, acutely aware that she was being evaluated like merchandise, which, she supposed, was exactly what she was. "You are younger than I expected," he observed, his tone neutral. "Your father led me to believe you were more experienced in the ways of society." "I am 19, Your Grace," Violet said quietly. "If that is insufficient for your purposes, I understand that arrangements can be reconsidered." Something flickered in Alistair's grey eyes, surprise perhaps at her directness. "On the contrary, Lady Violet, youth suggests malleability, the ability to adapt to new circumstances without the burden of previous attachments or expectations." The words stung, though Violet kept her expression carefully neutral. She was being told in the most polite terms possible that her value lay in her inexperience, her willingness to be shaped according to his preferences. "I see," she said simply. "Our marriage will take place in 3 days' time," Alistair continued, moving to pour himself a brandy from a crystal decanter. He did not offer her refreshment, Violet noted. "The ceremony will be small, a matter of legal necessity rather than celebration. I trust you have no objections to such arrangements." "None at all, Your Grace," Violet replied, though her heart clenched at the casual dismissal of what should have been one of the most important days of her life. "I am grateful for your consideration in this matter." "Gratitude is unnecessary," Alistair said curtly. "This is a business arrangement, nothing more. You will find that I am a fair man, Lady Violet, but I do not appreciate false sentiment or romantic delusions. We both understand the terms of this agreement." Violet felt something inside her recoil at his coldness, but she forced herself to nod. "Of course, Your Grace." "Excellent. Mrs. Hartwell will show you to your chambers and explain the household routines. You will find that Kensington Hall operates with precision and efficiency, qualities I value highly." As if summoned by his words, the housekeeper appeared in the doorway, a woman of middle years whose kind eyes seemed to offer the warmth that her master so conspicuously lacked. "Lady Violet," Mrs. Hartwell said with a genuine smile, "welcome to Kensington Hall. I've prepared the rose suite for your use. I do hope you'll find it comfortable." "Thank you," Violet said gratefully, relieved to encounter some human kindness in this imposing place. As she followed Mrs. Hartwell from the library, Violet caught a glimpse of Alistair returning to his position by the window, his attention already dismissed from her presence. She was, she realized, nothing more than a problem he had solved, a debt settled, a transaction completed. The Rose Suite proved to be a series of elegant chambers decorated in soft pastels, with a sitting room, bedroom and private dressing area that were larger than the entire upper floor of Marlowe Manor. Despite the luxury, Violet felt the weight of isolation settling around her like a shroud. "His Grace can seem rather formal at first meeting," Mrs. Hartwell said gently as she helped Violet unpack her meager belongings. "But he is a good man, my lady, fair and honorable, even if he doesn't show his feelings easily." "I'm sure you're right," Violet replied, though she wondered what feelings the Duke might possess beneath his icy exterior. "The staff is quite excited to have a mistress in the house again," Mrs. Hartwell continued. "It's been many years since Kensington Hall had a duchess in residence." "Many years?" Violet asked, curious despite herself. Mrs. Hartwell's expression grew carefully neutral. His Grace's first wife passed away some time ago, my lady. He has lived quite quietly since then. First wife. The words hit Violet like a physical blow. Alistair had been married before, loved before, perhaps, and she was merely a replacement, a second choice acquired through financial necessity rather than affection. I see, Violet managed to say. Thank you for telling me. That night, as Violet lay in the enormous four-poster bed that dominated her new bedroom, she stared up at the canopy and tried to imagine what her life would be like as the wife of a man who saw her as nothing more than a convenient solution to an inconvenient problem. She was to be a duchess, yes, but a duchess in name only. A woman married to a man who had made it clear that he expected nothing from her but compliance and discretion. Yet as she drifted towards sleep, Violet found herself remembering the moment when something had flickered in Alistair's grey eyes, a brief crack in his carefully maintained facade that suggested there might be more to the Duke of Kensington than he chose to reveal. Perhaps, she thought drowsily, there was hope for something more than a marriage of mere convenience. Perhaps even the coldest transactions could, with time and patience, warm into something resembling affection. The wedding. The morning of her wedding dawned grey and drizzling, as if the very heavens were weeping for the loveless union about to take place. Violet stood before the mirror in her chambers, studying her reflection in the simple white gown that Mrs. Hartwell had procured for the occasion. It was beautiful, certainly, silk and lace that spoke to the Duke's wealth and position, but it felt like a costume she was wearing to play a role she didn't understand. "You look lovely, my lady," Mrs. Hartwell said warmly, adjusting the delicate veil that would mark Violet's transformation from impoverished nobleman's daughter to duchess. "His Grace is a fortunate man." Violet managed a weak smile, wondering if fortune had anything to do with a marriage arranged to settle a gambling debt. "Thank you, Mrs. Hartwell. You've been very kind." The ceremony took place in the small chapel on the Kensington estate, with only a handful of witnesses present, the local vicar, Mrs. Hartwell, and a few other senior members of the household staff. Alistair stood at the altar in formal black, his expression as unreadable as ever, while Violet walked down the short aisle feeling as though she were attending her own funeral rather than her wedding. "Dearly beloved," the vicar began, his voice echoing in the small stone chamber, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of Alistair Charles Kensington, Duke of Kensington, and Lady Violet Elizabeth Marlowe in holy matrimony." The words washed over Violet like a tide, carrying her inexorably toward a future she had never chosen. When the time came to exchange vows, Alistair's voice was steady and emotionless, reciting the ancient words as if he were reading from a legal document. Violet's own voice trembled slightly, but she managed to speak the promises that would bind her to this stranger for the rest of her life. "You may kiss the bride," the vicar announced, and Violet felt her heart race as Alistair stepped closer. His kiss was brief and perfunctory, a mere brush of lips that spoke to duty rather than desire. When he pulled away, Violet saw nothing in his grey eyes but polite satisfaction at a task completed. "Your Grace," he said formally, offering her his arm, "shall we return to the house?" The wedding breakfast was a subdued affair, with Alistair maintaining polite conversation about estate matters and local politics, while Violet picked at her food and wondered what was expected of her now that she was officially the Duchess of Kensington. When the meal concluded, Alistair excused himself to attend to business, leaving Violet alone with Mrs. Hartwell, and the growing realization that her new husband had no more interest in her company now than he had before their marriage. "His Grace maintains a very regular schedule," Mrs. Hartwell explained, as she showed Violet through the main areas of the house. "He rises early for correspondence, spends the morning reviewing estate business, and typically rides out to inspect the properties in the afternoon. Evenings are usually spent in the library with his books and papers." "And where do I fit into this schedule?" Violet asked, trying to keep the loneliness from her voice. "I'm sure His Grace will make his expectations clear in due time," Mrs. Hartwell replied diplomatically. "In the meantime, you are mistress of this house, my lady. The staff is at your disposal, and you should feel free to make any changes you see fit." Mistress of the house. The title felt hollow when the master of the house showed no interest in her presence. Violet spent the remainder of her wedding day exploring her new home, marveling at the wealth and luxury that surrounded her, while feeling increasingly isolated within its magnificent walls. That evening, as she prepared for bed in her solitary chambers, Violet found herself wondering if this was to be her life. Endless days of elegant loneliness, married to a man who treated her with the same distant courtesy he might show a house guest who had overstayed her welcome. A soft knock at her door interrupted her melancholy thoughts. "Come in," she called, expecting to see Mrs. Hartwell or one of the maids. Instead, Alistair stepped into her sitting room, still dressed in his formal wedding attire, but with his cravat loosened and his dark hair slightly dishevelled. For the first time since her arrival, he looked almost human. "Your Grace," Violet said, rising from her chair by the fireplace. "I wasn't expecting. I came to clarify certain expectations regarding our marriage," Alistair said, his voice carefully controlled. "I realize we did not have the opportunity to discuss such matters before the ceremony." Violet felt her cheeks warm with embarrassment. She had been wondering about this very subject, dreading the moment when her new husband would claim his marital rights. "Of course, Your Grace. I understand my duties as your wife." Something flickered across Alistair's features, an emotion too quick to identify. "That is precisely what I wish to address, Lady Violet. This marriage is, as I have said, a business arrangement. I do not expect, that is, I will not require, intimate relations between us." The words hit Violet like a slap, though she wasn't sure why. She should have felt relief. Instead, she felt a strange sense of rejection, as if she had been found wanting before she had even been tested. "I see," she managed to say. "And if, that is, what about the question of an heir?" "I have cousins who can inherit the title," Alistair replied curtly. "The continuation of the direct line is not essential." "Very well," Violet said quietly. "I understand. Is there anything else you wish to clarify?" Alistair studied her for a long moment, his grey eyes unreadable. "You seem disappointed. I had thought you would be relieved by such an arrangement." "I am not disappointed, Your Grace," Violet lied. "Merely adjusting to my new circumstances. It will take time to understand my place in this household." "Your place is that of my Duchess," Alistair said, his tone softening slightly. "You will be treated with all the respect and deference due to that position. In return, I ask only that you conduct yourself with the dignity befitting the Kensington name." "Of course, Your Grace." Alistair moved toward the door, then paused. "Violet, Lady Violet, I want you to know that this arrangement is not a reflection of any inadequacy on your part. The fault lies entirely with me." Before she could ask what he meant, he was gone, leaving Violet alone with more questions than answers. What fault did he speak of? What had happened in his past to make him so determined to keep her at arm's length? As she prepared for bed that night, Violet found herself thinking about the brief moment when Alistair's carefully controlled facade had slipped, revealing something that looked almost like pain. Whatever had shaped him into the cold, distant man she had married, it ran deeper than mere preference for solitude. Perhaps, she thought as she settled into her lonely bed, there was more to the Duke of Kensington than met the eye. Perhaps beneath his icy exterior lay a man who had been hurt so deeply that he had forgotten how to trust, how to love, how to hope for anything more than the safe distance of a business arrangement. And perhaps if she was very patient and very careful, she might find a way to reach that hidden man and show him that even the most carefully guarded hearts could learn to love again. The thaw begins. The weeks following their wedding settled into a routine that was both comfortable and deeply frustrating for Violet. She had been given free rein over the household, and Mrs. Hartwell proved to be an invaluable ally in helping her understand the complex workings of such a grand estate. The servants, initially wary of their new mistress, gradually warmed to her gentle manner and genuine interest in their welfare. Alistair, meanwhile, maintained his rigid schedule with military precision. They shared breakfast each morning, during which he would inquire politely about her plans for the day and share any relevant information about estate business or social obligations. Their conversations were cordial but distant, like two strangers sharing a coaching inn rather than husband and wife sharing a home. It was during one of these morning meals that Violet first glimpsed the man beneath the Duke's carefully maintained facade. "I've received an invitation to the Pemberton Ball next week," Alistair announced, setting aside his correspondence. "It will be your first appearance in society as my Duchess. I trust you feel prepared for such an occasion." Violet looked up from her toast, feeling a flutter of nervousness at the prospect. "I believe so, Your Grace. Mrs. Hartwell has been most helpful in explaining the proper protocols." "Good. The Ton can be unforgiving to those who fail to meet their expectations." Something in his tone made Violet look at him more closely, and she caught a glimpse of what might have been old pain flickering in his grey eyes. "Have you had Difficult experiences with society, Your Grace? She asked gently. Alistair's expression immediately shuttered, the moment of vulnerability disappearing behind his usual mask of polite indifference. I simply wish to ensure that you are not subjected to unnecessary scrutiny or gossip. But Violet had seen enough to know that there was a story there, something that had taught the Duke to guard himself so carefully against the judgment of others. She filed the observation away, adding it to the growing collection of small clues about the man she had married. The Pemberton ball proved to be exactly the ordeal Violet had feared. From the moment they arrived at the Grand London mansion, she felt the weight of curious stares and whispered speculation. The Tun had been buzzing with rumours about the Duke of Kensington's sudden marriage to an unknown young woman, and Violet could practically hear the calculations being made about her background, her dowry, and her worthiness to bear such an illustrious title. "The new Duchess of Kensington," she heard one matron whisper to another as they passed. "Such a young thing. I wonder what her family connections are." "Marlowe, I believe," came the reply, "though I can't say I'm familiar with the line. Perhaps a minor branch of the family." Violet felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment, acutely aware that her simple background was being dissected by women who had been born to wealth and privilege. She glanced at Alistair, walking beside her with his usual air of cool authority, and wondered if he was regretting his decision to bring such an unsuitable wife into society. "Pay them no mind," he said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. "Their opinions matter less than they believe." The evening progressed with a series of introductions and polite conversations, during which Violet did her best to project the dignity and grace that Mrs. Hartwell had coached her to display. She was beginning to think that perhaps she might survive the evening with her reputation intact when disaster struck in the form of Lady Pemberton herself. "Your Grace," the hostess said, approaching with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "How delightful to finally meet your new Duchess. Such a charming young woman." "Lady Pemberton," Alistair replied with cool politeness. "Thank you for including us in your gathering." Of course. "I must say, Your Grace, your marriage came as quite a surprise to us all. So sudden, so unexpected. One can't help but wonder what prompted such a hasty decision." Violet felt the blood drain from her face as she realized the implication behind Lady Pemberton's words. The woman was suggesting, in the most polite terms possible, that the marriage had been necessitated by some scandal or impropriety. "I'm afraid I don't take your meaning," Alistair said, his voice carrying a dangerous edge that made several nearby conversations falter. "Oh, forgive me," Lady Pemberton said with false contrition. "I simply meant that love must have struck with remarkable swiftness for you to abandon your, shall we say, previous preferences for solitude." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Violet could feel the attention of the entire ballroom focusing on their small group. This was the moment when her husband would either defend their marriage or allow society to draw its own conclusions about the circumstances that had brought them together. To her surprise, Alistair stepped closer to her, his hand coming to rest possessively on her waist in a gesture that spoke of intimate familiarity. "Indeed," he said, his grey eyes fixed on Lady Pemberton with an intensity that made the older woman take an involuntary step backward. "When one encounters perfection, Lady Pemberton, only a fool would hesitate to claim it. I may be many things, but I am not a fool." The declaration sent a ripple of surprised murmurs through the gathered crowd, and Violet felt her heart skip a beat at the unexpected warmth in his voice. For a moment she almost believed that he meant it, that she truly was precious to him rather than merely a convenient solution to a financial obligation. "How romantic," Lady Pemberton managed, clearly flustered by Alistair's response. "I do hope you'll both be very happy together." "We already are," Alistair replied smoothly, his hand tightening slightly on Violet's waist. "Aren't we, my dear?" "Yes," Violet managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. "Very happy indeed." The rest of the evening passed in a blur of congratulations and speculative glances, with Alistair maintaining his role as devoted husband with a skill that left Violet wondering where performance ended and reality began. When they finally returned to their carriage for the journey home, she found herself stealing glances at his profile, trying to understand the man who could project such convincing warmth in public while maintaining such careful distance in private. "Thank you," she said quietly, as the carriage rolled through the London streets. "For what?" Alistair asked, his attention focused on the passing scenery. "For defending me. For making them believe that our marriage was, that we what, Violet?" The use of her given name sent a small thrill through her, and she found herself looking at him with new eyes. That we care for each other. That this marriage is more than just a business arrangement. Alistair was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was so low she had to strain to hear it. Perhaps it is becoming more than that. The words hung between them like a bridge, fragile and uncertain, but offering the possibility of connection. Violet felt her heart race as she considered the implications of what he had said, the suggestion that perhaps their marriage of convenience might evolve into something deeper. "Alistair," she said softly, using his given name for the first time. "I want you to know that I hope we can—" But when she turned to look at him, she found that his expression had shuttered once again, the moment of vulnerability disappearing behind his familiar mask of polite indifference. "We should retire early tonight," he said, his voice returning to its usual formal tone. "Tomorrow will bring its own challenges." As they returned to Kensington Hall and went their separate ways to their individual chambers, Violet found herself replaying the evening's events, particularly that moment when Alistair had seemed to lower his guard just enough to suggest that their relationship might be capable of growth. Perhaps, she thought as she prepared for bed, there was hope for their marriage after all. Perhaps the man who had defended her so eloquently in public might eventually learn to trust her with the private thoughts and feelings he guarded so carefully. Perhaps, with patience and understanding, she might find a way to reach the heart that he kept so carefully hidden from the world. Breaking barriers. The morning after the Pemberton ball brought an unexpected development that would change the dynamic between Violet and Alistair forever. Violet was taking her customary walk through the estate gardens when she heard the sound of voices raised in distress coming from the direction of the stables. Following the commotion, she discovered a small crowd gathered around a magnificent black stallion that was clearly in distress, its eyes rolling wildly as it fought against the restraints that several grooms were attempting to apply. "Easy, boy," one of the grooms was saying, his voice tight with concern. "We're trying to help you." "What's wrong with him?" Violet asked, approaching cautiously. "Colic, my lady," the head groom replied grimly. "Bad case of it too. We've sent for the veterinary, but—" He shook his head, his expression suggesting that the situation was dire. Violet studied the distressed animal, her heart going out to the magnificent creature that was clearly suffering. She had grown up around horses at Marlow Manor, and while their stable had been modest compared to this grand establishment, she had learned a great deal about equine care from their old groom. "Has he been walked?" she asked. "We've tried, my lady, but he's too agitated. Won't let anyone near him." Violet moved closer to the horse, speaking in the low, soothing tones that she had learned could sometimes calm a frightened animal. "There, beautiful boy, I know you're hurting. Let me help you." To everyone's surprise, the stallion's ears pricked forward at the sound of her voice, and his wild thrashing began to subside slightly. "My lady," the groom said nervously, "perhaps you should step back. He's unpredictable in this state." But Violet was already moving closer, her hand extended toward the horse's muzzle. "What's his name?" "Midnight, my lady. He's His Grace's favorite mount." "Hello, Midnight," Violet said softly, allowing the horse to catch her scent before gently placing her hand on his neck. "I know it hurts, but we need to get you moving. It's the only way to help." Incredibly, the stallion allowed her to take his lead rope, and she began to walk him slowly around the stable yard, speaking to him in the same gentle tones throughout. The grooms watched in amazement as the previously unmanageable animal followed her lead, his breathing gradually becoming less labored. It was in this scene that Alistair found them when he arrived at the stables, having been summoned by a frantic servant who reported that his prize stallion was dying and his Duchess was attempting to handle the dangerous animal herself. "What the devil?" he began, then stopped short as he took in the sight of Violet walking calmly with Midnight. The horse's condition clearly improved from whatever state it had been in earlier. "Your Grace," the head groom said quickly. "Her Grace has been working with Midnight for the past hour. He was in a terrible state when she arrived, but she's managed to calm him down considerably." Alistair watched in silence as Violet continued her patient work with the horse, noting the way the animal responded to her touch and voice. When the veterinary finally arrived and pronounced that the crisis had passed thanks to the walking treatment that had been administered, Alistair found himself looking at his wife with new eyes. "Where did you learn to handle horses like that?" he asked as they walked back toward the house together. "At home, at Marlow Manor," Violet replied, suddenly self-conscious about her unconventional behavior. "We had a small stable, and our groom taught me about caring for sick horses. I hope I didn't overstep. You saved Midnight's life, Alistair said quietly. That horse, he was a gift from my late wife. He means a great deal to me. The mention of his first wife sent a pang through Violet's heart, but she also recognized the significance of what he had just shared. For the first time since their marriage, Alistair had voluntarily revealed something personal about his past. I'm glad I could help, she said simply. They walked in comfortable silence for a few moments before Alistair spoke again. Violet, I owe you an apology. For what? For assuming that you were merely a sheltered young woman with no practical skills or experience. It was unfair of me to judge you based on your age and circumstances. Violet felt a warm glow at his words, the first genuine compliment he had paid her since their marriage. Thank you for saying that. It means more than you know. Perhaps, Alistair said slowly, as if the words were being dragged from him against his will, we might take dinner together this evening, in the small dining room rather than the formal hall, if you would find that agreeable. The invitation was hesitant, almost shy, and Violet felt her heart leap at this small sign of progress in their relationship. I would like that very much. That evening's dinner proved to be a revelation for both of them. Away from the formal atmosphere of the grand dining hall, with its imposing portraits and ceremonial place settings, the intimate setting of the small dining room seemed to encourage a more relaxed conversation than they had yet shared. Tell me about your life at Marlow Manor, Alistair said, as they shared a bottle of wine that had loosened his usual reserve. What was it like growing up there? Violet hesitated, unsure how much of the truth she should reveal about her father's gambling and the gradual decline of their circumstances. It was quiet, she said carefully. We lived simply, but I was happy enough. I spent most of my time in the gardens or the stables, or reading in the library when the weather was poor. And your father? What manner of man is Lord Marlow? The question struck at the heart of Violet's deepest shame, and she found herself struggling to find words that would not reveal the full extent of her father's failings. He is a complicated man, she said finally. He has faced many challenges in recent years. Alistair studied her face with those penetrating grey eyes, and Violet had the uncomfortable feeling that he could see straight through her diplomatic evasions to the painful truth beneath. Violet, he said gently, I am aware of the circumstances that led to our marriage. Your father's debts, his difficulties with gambling. You need not pretend otherwise. The words hit Violet like a physical blow, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks as the full humiliation of her situation crashed over her anew. I see, she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Then you know exactly what you purchased when you agreed to marry me. That's not, Alistair began, then stopped himself, running a hand through his dark hair in a gesture of frustration. Violet, I didn't mean to cause you pain. I simply wanted you to know that you don't need to hide the truth from me. The truth, Violet repeated bitterly, is that my father sold me to pay for a horse he had no business wagering in the first place. The truth is that I'm nothing more than a debt settlement, a transaction completed to satisfy a gambling obligation. Is that what you wanted to hear? Alistair was quiet for a long moment, his expression unreadable as he considered her words. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of emotion that surprised her. The truth, he said slowly, is that I have spent the past weeks watching you transform this house from a cold, empty shell into something that feels like a home. The truth is that you saved my horse's life today with skills and compassion that no amount of money could purchase. The truth is that you are worth far more than your father ever realized, and I am beginning to understand that I may have gained far more from our arrangement than I gave. Violet stared at him in amazement, hardly able to believe what she was hearing. Alistair, you don't need to— I'm not saying this out of pity or obligation, he interrupted, his grey eyes intense as they held hers. I'm saying it because it's true. You have brought something to this house, to my life, that I didn't even realize was missing. What is that? Violet asked softly. Light, Alistair said simply. Warmth. The possibility that life might hold more than mere duty and obligation. The words hung between them like a bridge, fragile but real, offering the possibility of connection that neither had dared to hope for. Violet felt tears prick her eyes as she realized that perhaps, just perhaps, their marriage might become something more than the cold arrangement it had begun as. Alistair, she said hesitantly, may I ask you something? Of course. Your first wife. What happened to her? Alistair's expression immediately shuttered, the moment of openness disappearing behind his familiar mask of controlled reserve. For a moment, Violet thought he would refuse to answer, would retreat back into the cold distance that had characterized their relationship thus far. But then, slowly, he began to speak. "Her name was Catherine," he said quietly, his voice carefully controlled. "We were married for 3 years. She died in childbirth along with our son." The stark words hit Violet like a physical blow, and she felt her heart break for the pain she heard beneath his carefully neutral tone. "Alistair, I'm so sorry. I can't imagine." "It was 5 years ago," he continued, as if he hadn't heard her words of sympathy. "I swore then that I would never again allow myself to become so vulnerable. The pain of losing them nearly destroyed me." Suddenly, so many things about Alistair made sense. His emotional distance, his insistence that their marriage remain a business arrangement, his careful avoidance of any intimacy that might lead to the kind of devastating loss he had already endured. "Is that why you don't want— that is, why you said our marriage would not include—" Violet began, then trailed off, unable to finish the delicate question. "Intimate relations," Alistair finished for her, his voice flat. "Yes, I cannot bear the thought of losing another child, another wife. It's better to maintain distance, to avoid the possibility of such pain." "But Alistair," Violet said gently, "by avoiding the possibility of loss, aren't you also avoiding the possibility of joy, of love, of all the things that make life worth living?" Alistair's grey eyes met hers, and for a moment she saw such raw pain in their depths that she wanted to reach across the table and take his hand, to offer whatever comfort she could. But before she could act on the impulse, he had looked away, his expression closing off once again. "Perhaps," he said quietly, "some risks are too great to take. And perhaps," Violet replied with gentle firmness, "some rewards are too precious to forfeit out of fear." They finished their dinner in contemplative silence, each lost in their own thoughts about the revelations that had been shared. When Alistair escorted her to her chambers that evening, he paused at her door with an expression that seemed to war between longing and restraint. "Thank you," he said finally. "For what?" "For listening, for not judging, for being you." Before Violet could respond, he had turned and walked away, leaving her standing in her doorway with her heart racing and her mind spinning with the implications of everything that had passed between them that evening. The walls come down. The weeks following their intimate dinner conversation brought a gradual but noticeable change in the atmosphere at Kensington Hall. While Alistair still maintained his careful emotional distance, there were small signs that the walls he had built around his heart were beginning to develop cracks. He began joining Violet for her morning walks through the gardens, initially claiming that he needed to inspect various aspects of the estate, but gradually settling into comfortable conversation about books, politics, and their shared observations about the changing seasons. He started asking for her opinion on household matters and estate business, treating her insights with a respect that made her feel truly valued for the first time in her life. Most significantly, he began to share small details about his past. Stories about his childhood, his education, his travels abroad before his first marriage. Each revelation felt like a gift to Violet, a sign that perhaps he was beginning to trust her with the pieces of himself that he had kept so carefully guarded. It was during one of these morning walks, as they paused to admire the late autumn roses that still bloomed in the formal garden, that Violet finally found the courage to address the growing tension between them. "Alistair," she said quietly, her eyes fixed on a particularly beautiful red rose that seemed to glow in the morning sunlight. "I need to ask you something, and I hope you'll give me an honest answer." "Of course," he replied, though she could hear the wariness in his voice. "Do you think there's any possibility that our marriage might become more than what it is now? That we might find a way to be truly husband and wife, in every sense of the word?" Alistair was quiet for so long that Violet began to fear she had overstepped, that her question had driven him back behind the walls of reserve that had only just begun to lower. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with conflict. "Violet, what you're asking, I'm asking whether you think you could ever care for me," she said, turning to face him directly. "Whether there's any chance that what we have could grow into something real. Because, Alistair, I need you to know that my feelings for you have already begun to change." The admission hung between them like a challenge, and Violet held her breath as she waited for his response. She had laid her heart bare, risked everything on the hope that the man she was beginning to love might be capable of loving her in return. "Violet," Alistair said finally, his voice rough with emotion, "you don't understand what you're asking. The risk—" "I understand perfectly," she interrupted, stepping closer to him with a courage that surprised them both. I understand that loving someone means risking loss, risking pain, risking heartbreak, but I also understand that the alternative, living without love, without connection, without hope, is a kind of death in itself. Alistair stared at her, his grey eyes turbulent with emotions he was struggling to contain. "You're so young," he said quietly, "so innocent. You don't know what it's like to lose everything that matters to you." "Don't I?" Violet challenged. "I lost my mother when I was 12. I lost my home, my security, my future, when my father's gambling destroyed our family. I lost my freedom and my right to choose my own destiny when I was sold to pay his debts. I may be young, Alistair, but I am not naive about loss." Her words seemed to strike him like physical blows, and Violet saw something shift in his expression, a recognition, perhaps, that she was stronger than he had given her credit for. "But despite all of that," she continued, her voice growing stronger with conviction, "I still believe that love is worth the risk. I still believe that two people who care for each other can create something beautiful together, even if they can't guarantee that it will last forever." Alistair reached out suddenly, his hands framing her face with a gentleness that made her breath catch. "Violet," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "I am so afraid of losing you." "Then don't," she whispered back, her hands coming up to cover his. "Don't lose me to fear, to the past, to the walls you've built to protect yourself. I'm here, Alistair. I'm real, and I'm not going anywhere." For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, they stood frozen in that tableau, his hands on her face, her hands covering his, their eyes locked in a connection that transcended words. Then, slowly, inevitably, Alistair lowered his head and kissed her. This kiss was nothing like the perfunctory brush of lips they had shared at their wedding. This was a kiss born of longing and hope and the gradual crumbling of carefully constructed defenses. It spoke of desire long suppressed and emotions finally acknowledged. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, their foreheads resting together as they tried to process the magnitude of what had just passed between them. "Violet," Alistair said, his voice hoarse with emotion, "I don't know if I can be the husband you deserve. I don't know if I can overcome my fears enough to give you what you need." "I don't need you to be perfect," Violet replied, her hands still resting on his chest, where she could feel the rapid beating of his heart. "I just need you to try. I need you to believe that what we could have together is worth fighting for. And if I fail, if I disappoint you, if I prove to be as broken as I fear I am, then we'll face that together too," Violet said with quiet certainty. "Alistair, marriage isn't about being perfect. It's about choosing each other again and again, through whatever challenges life brings." Alistair studied her face for a long moment, searching for any sign of doubt or uncertainty. What he found instead was a strength and determination that humbled him, a love that asked for nothing more than the chance to grow. "Very well," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Very well, my brave, beautiful wife. Let us see what we can build together." The words were a promise, a commitment to try, and Violet felt her heart soar with hope as she realized that perhaps their marriage of convenience might indeed become something far more precious, a union built on mutual respect, growing affection, and the courage to risk their hearts for the possibility of true love. A true union. The transformation in their marriage was not immediate, but it was profound. Over the following weeks, Alistair began the slow, careful process of dismantling the emotional barriers he had erected around his heart. It was like watching a flower bloom in slow motion. Each day brought small signs of progress, tiny revelations that spoke to his growing trust and affection. He began spending his evenings with Violet, rather than retreating to his solitary study. They would sit together in the smaller drawing room, reading companionably or discussing the events of the day. Sometimes Violet would play the pianoforte, while Alistair worked on correspondence, the gentle music creating an atmosphere of domestic harmony that neither had experienced before. Most significantly, Alistair began to share more details about his first marriage and the devastating loss that had shaped his approach to life. These conversations were often difficult, marked by long silences and carefully controlled emotion, but they served to deepen Violet's understanding of the man she had married and strengthen the bond that was growing between them. "Catherine was very different from you," he told her one evening as they sat before the fire, her needlework in her lap and his book forgotten on the side table. "She was fragile, I suppose." delicate in a way that made me feel protective, but also anxious. I was constantly worried about her health, her happiness, her safety. And yet, you still lost her, Violet observed gently. Yes, Alistair said, his voice heavy with old grief. Despite all my efforts to protect her, I still lost her. And our son. It taught me that love offers no guarantees, no protection against loss. But it also taught you how precious love can be, Violet pointed out. Otherwise the loss wouldn't have hurt so much. Alistair looked at her with something approaching wonder. How did you become so wise at 19? Perhaps because I've learned that life is too short to waste on fear, Violet replied. Perhaps because I've discovered that the greatest tragedy is not loss, but the failure to love at all. It was during one of these intimate evening conversations that Alistair finally took the step that would transform their marriage from a relationship of growing affection to one of true intimacy. Violet, he said suddenly, setting aside his brandy and turning to face her fully, I want you to know that my feelings for you have changed considerably since our wedding day. Have they? Violet asked softly, her heart beginning to race at the intensity in his grey eyes. Yes, he said, rising from his chair and moving to kneel beside hers, taking her hands in his, with a reverence that made her breath catch. Violet, I believe I am falling in love with you. No, I know I am falling in love with you. The question is whether you could ever feel the same way about a man who has been such a poor husband to you thus far. Oh, Alistair, Violet whispered, her eyes filling with tears of joy. I've been in love with you for weeks. I was just waiting for you to realize that you might feel the same way. The confession broke the last of Alistair's restraint, and he pulled her into his arms with a passion that spoke to months of suppressed longing. When he kissed her this time, it was with the full knowledge that she loved him in return, that their marriage had indeed become something far more precious than either had dared to hope. Violet, he murmured against her lips, will you? That is, would you consider? Our marriage has been unconsummated thus far, but if you're willing. Yes, Violet whispered, her cheeks flushing with a combination of shyness and anticipation. Yes, Alistair, I want to be your wife in every way. That night marked the true beginning of their marriage as husband and wife. Alistair approached their union with a tenderness and patience that spoke to his deep love for her, taking care to ensure that Violet's first experience of intimacy was one of pleasure rather than mere duty. In the quiet sanctuary of his chambers, for she had moved from the Rose Suite to share his rooms, they discovered a passion that neither had expected but both had longed for. The physical consummation of their marriage was accompanied by an emotional intimacy that transformed them both. Alistair found that loving Violet did not diminish his memories of Catherine, but rather added a new dimension to his understanding of what love could be. Where his first marriage had been built on protection and careful nurturing, his relationship with Violet was founded on mutual strength and shared courage. Violet, for her part, discovered that being loved by Alistair was nothing like the cold transaction she had feared when she first arrived at Kensington Hall. Instead, it was a daily affirmation of her worth, a constant reminder that she was valued not for what she could provide, but for who she was. Facing the world. The change in their relationship did not go unnoticed by the household staff, who had watched with growing hope as their master and mistress gradually found their way to each other. Mrs. Hartwell, in particular, seemed to take personal satisfaction in the obvious happiness of the couple she had helped to nurture. "It does my heart good to see His Grace smiling again," she confided to Violet one morning as they reviewed the household accounts. "He was such a different man after he lost his first wife and child. We all worried that he would never find happiness again." "He's taught me that healing is possible," Violet replied, thinking of the gradual transformation she had witnessed in her husband. "That love can indeed grow from the most unlikely circumstances. And you, my lady, have taught him that taking risks can lead to rewards rather than just loss," Mrs. Hartwell observed with a knowing smile. The first real test of their newfound happiness came when they received an invitation to a grand ball hosted by the Duke and Duchess of Marlborough. It would be their first major social appearance since the Pemberton Ball, and Violet felt all her old anxieties returning as she contemplated facing the Tun's scrutiny once again. "They'll be watching us," she told Alistair as they prepared for the evening, "looking for signs that our marriage is what they suspected, a cold arrangement based on financial necessity rather than affection." "Then we'll give them something else to talk about," Alistair replied, coming up behind her as she sat at her dressing table and placing his hands on her shoulders. We'll show them what a marriage based on love looks like. And if they don't believe it, if they think we're merely putting on a performance for their benefit, Alistair met her eyes in the mirror, his expression serious but unafraid. Then that says more about them than it does about us, my love. Violet, I refuse to hide our happiness or apologize for the way our marriage began. What matters is not how we started, but what we've become. The Marlborough Ball was indeed a glittering affair, with the cream of London society gathered in the magnificent ballroom to see and be seen. As Violet and Alistair made their entrance, she could feel the familiar weight of curious stares and whispered speculation. But this time was different. This time she walked into the ballroom not as a nervous young woman unsure of her place, but as a duchess who was genuinely loved by her husband. The confidence that came from that knowledge transformed her bearing, and she found herself able to meet the curious gazes with calm dignity. "Your Grace," Lady Pemberton approached them early in the evening, her expression carefully neutral. "How lovely to see you both again. You look radiant this evening." "Thank you, Lady Pemberton," Violet replied with genuine warmth. "Marriage agrees with me, I find." "Indeed," Alistair added, his arm tightening slightly around Violet's waist in a gesture that spoke of possessive affection. "I consider myself the most fortunate of men." As the evening progressed, it became clear that their obvious happiness was having the desired effect on the assembled company. Where once there had been speculation about the true nature of their relationship, now there was grudging admiration for the obvious affection between them. When Alistair led Violet onto the dance floor for the first waltz, the entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath. They moved together with a grace and harmony that spoke to their deep connection, their eyes never leaving each other's faces as they swept across the polished floor. "They're watching us," Violet murmured, as they turned in perfect synchronization. "Let them watch," Alistair replied, his grey eyes warm with love. "Let them see what real love looks like. Let them see that sometimes the most unlikely beginnings can lead to the most beautiful endings." As the waltz came to an end and the other couples began to applaud, Violet realized that they had indeed accomplished what they had set out to do. The Tun might have expected to witness a cold, formal partnership between a duke and his convenient wife. Instead, they had been treated to the sight of two people who had found genuine love against all odds. 3 years later, the gardens of Kensington Hall were in full bloom on the morning that Violet gave birth to their first child, a son who would one day inherit the dukedom and carry on the family name. As Alistair held his newborn heir for the first time, Violet saw tears in his grey eyes. Tears of joy rather than the grief that had marked his previous experience of fatherhood. "He's perfect," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion as he studied the tiny face of his son. "Absolutely perfect." "What shall we call him?" Violet asked, exhausted but radiant with happiness. "James," Alistair said without hesitation. "James Edward Kensington, a name that speaks to both tradition and new beginnings." As Violet watched her husband cradle their son with infinite tenderness, she marveled at the journey that had brought them to this moment. 3 years ago, she had arrived at Kensington Hall as little more than payment for a gambling debt, a young woman with no prospects and no hope for happiness. Now she was a duchess, a wife, and a mother. But more than that, she was beloved. The man who had purchased her as a convenience had become the love of her life, and their marriage had proven that even the most transactional beginnings could blossom into something beautiful when nurtured with patience, understanding, and courage. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked Alistair one evening as they sat together in the nursery, watching their son sleep peacefully in his cradle. "Regret what?" he asked, though his tone suggested he knew exactly what she meant. "Taking such a risk, opening your heart again after everything you had lost." Alistair was quiet for a moment, his grey eyes thoughtful as he considered her question. "Never," he said finally, his voice firm with conviction. "Violet, you taught me that love is not about avoiding loss. It's about embracing the possibility of joy, even when we know it comes with risks. You showed me that a heart that has been broken can still learn to love again, perhaps even more deeply than before. And you taught me that I was worth more than the price of a horse," Violet replied with a smile that held both humor and deep emotion. "You showed me that sometimes the most unlikely circumstances can lead to the greatest happiness." As they sat together in the peaceful nursery, surrounded by the evidence of their love and the promise of their future, both Alistair and Violet understood that their story had become something far more precious than either had dared to hope. They had taken a cold transaction and transformed it into a love story that would be remembered for generations, a testament to the power of patience, understanding, and the courage to risk one's heart for the possibility of true happiness. The Duke had indeed purchased a bride for the price of a single horse, but what he had gained was infinitely more valuable than any amount of money could buy. He had found love, hope, and the promise of a future filled with joy, proving that sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin with the most unlikely circumstances, and that true love can indeed bloom from the most barren soil when tended with care and nurtured with faith. Their marriage had begun as a business arrangement, but it had become a partnership of hearts, minds, and souls, a union that proved that love, when it is real and true, can overcome any obstacle and transform any circumstance into something beautiful. And as they looked toward the future, with their son sleeping peacefully between them and their love stronger than ever, they knew that their greatest adventures were still to come. Their love story became a beacon of hope that illuminated the truth that genuine worth is not measured in gold or social standing, but in the courage to love and be loved in return. Duke Alastair Kensington and Duchess Violet proved that when two hearts are willing to be vulnerable, to take risks, and to believe in the possibility of happiness, even the most unlikely circumstances can give birth to the most extraordinary love. Their union showed the world that true nobility comes not from birth or wealth, but from the strength to overcome fear, the wisdom to recognize love when it appears in unexpected forms, and the courage to nurture that love until it blooms into something that transforms not just two lives, but everyone who witnesses its power.